Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick. I'm the head of program here at Interspecies Internet. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the trustees and the organization to another Interspecies Conversations lecture. Interspecies Conversations is a monthly online lecture series where leading thinkers share ideas and research that deepens our understanding of communication and cognition in other species. We aim to platform emerging discoveries and host open discussion where the community can join the conversation with questions and feedback. If you enjoy today's event, please consider donating to Interspecies Internet to help support our programming and other projects and activities. You can find a link to our donation page on our website, which is interspecies.io, as well as in the video descriptions on our YouTube channel. And at some point in the call today, Carol will share a link in the chat as well. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Dr. David Omer, who will be presenting the naming of non-human primates, vocal labeling of others by marmoset monkeys. So humans, dolphins, and elephants are the only known species that vocally label their conspecifics. It remains unclear whether non-human primates share this ability. David Omer and his team recorded spontaneous phee-call dialogues between pairs of marmoset monkeys, and Omer's laboratory discovered that marmosets use these calls to vocally label their conspecifics. Moreover, they respond more consistently and correctly to calls that are specifically directed at them. Analysis of calls from multiple monkeys revealed that family members use similar calls and acoustic features to label others and perform vocal learning. So these findings shed light on the complexities of social vocalizations among non-human primates and suggest that marmoset vocalizations may provide a model for understanding aspects of human language, thereby offering new insights into the evolution of social communication. David Omer is a neuroscientist specializing in the study of neural circuits that underlie complex behaviors. He earned his PhD under the mentorship of Professor Amiran Grinvald at the Weizmann Institute of Science. Following his doctoral work, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship with Professor Nikos Logothetis at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, and another with Professor Nachum Alinovsky back at the Weizmann Institute. During his postdoctoral research, Dr. Omer made a significant discovery that hippocampal place cells represent not only an individual's own position in space, but also the positions of others. This groundbreaking finding expanded the understanding of how the brain encodes social spatial information. And in 2019, Dr. Omer joined the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences as a faculty member, where he established Israel's first laboratory to use the common marmoset as an animal model. His lab focuses on studying the physiology of brain networks involved in cognitive processes that enable humans to navigate both physical and social spaces. And additionally, his work explores the neural evolution of vocal communication and language in non-human primates. His research has already yielded significant discoveries, including the first demonstration of vocal labeling of others by non-human primates, a finding that challenges previous notions about the limitations of non-human primate communication. So, Dr. Omer, thank you so much for joining us today. And whenever you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. Let me share my screen. Just a second. Can you see my slide? Okay. So again, thank you for the nice introduction. My name is David Omer. I'm from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I'm going to talk about our recent finding vocal labeling of other by marmoset monkeys. Before I begin, first of all, I hope you're not confused by the picture of a cat. Bear with me, I'll more or less explain why we have a cat on the first slide, but it's going to be clear toward the end of my talk. So before I start, I'd like to take you a little bit deeper into what my lab is studying and more or less explain the motivation for the for the study or for the finding that I'm going to describe today. As you heard, originally my lab is coming from a bit from a different field. I study neural circuit in a magnificent brain structure called the hippocampus, which is lighted here, as you can see in this picture. Totally remote from the field of vocal communication, but turned out that those two different fields sort of has more than what was thought before in common. And I'm going to explain this in more details. What's special about the hippocampus is mostly the fact that what we know today about the hippocampus, that it's involved in mapping our physical space around us. This is a classical example from a neuron from the hippocampus, which we call place cells, and those place cells are tuned to particular position in space, as you can see in this example. So this is a cartoon showing a rat traveling a two-dimensional box. And you can see that in this cartoonish picture, the place cells fire only at a particular position in space. And we have many place cells like this in the hippocampus. And together, if you combine them, they actually form a cognitive physical map of physical space. And there are many other this type of representation that we already know today. Place cells is only one example. We also know that there are cells called head direction cells, which represent the heading direction of the animal, and also border cells representing borders in the environment, even grid cells. But without going deeply into those fascinating neural representation, there's one very pronounced common denominator about all of this representation, and this common denominator is basically the fact that they all represent my position in space. And this is, if you think about it, it's a little bit weird because I think it's obvious to all of us that for every social animals, the ability to coordinate behavior with others, both in space and time, is absolutely crucial for our survival and reproduction. I mean, we cannot survive without these abilities. And it seems very strange that this sort of a very complex and sophisticated system in the hippocampus seems to care only about my position in space. So recently, we and others started to sort of shatter this dogma, first by showing that place cells, those tiny cells that represent my position in space, are actually capable of representing position of other conspecific in space. And we did this in flying bats, as you can see in this example. Just to walk you a little bit through through this picture. So I showed you before a cartoon showing trajectories of a rat traveling in space. This is a similar example. This time there's a bat flying from one position to two other positions in space. It's a top view. So the gray lines are the trajectory flights of a bat. And you can see that when he's flying, marked by red dots here are the spiking activity of a single place cell in his hippocampus. And you can see on the top picture, you can see that this, which shows the probability of this neuron to fire, you can see that it's tuned to a particular position, like I showed you a moment ago. But if we look at the same cell, but this time when another bat is flying in the room, so this time the gray trajectories are trajectories of another bat flying in the room, and the bat that we record from is completely stationary on the start position over here. We can see that the same neuron also represents the position of another bat. Let me just switch on the okay, so I hope you can see my cursor. So what we were able to show is that basically place cells do not only represent my position in space, but they also represent position of others, which, as I showed you, was the reasonable thing to expect from a system representing space in the brain. And we also later on showed that different types of cells, without going into the details, which are called time cells, and were thought until recently to represent elapsed time relative to my actions in the physical world. For example, relative to my onset of flight from position A to position B, and so on. We were able to show that those same time cells also count or track elapsed time in the context of other conspecific actions. In this particular example, it was the landing moment of another bat in the room. So we were able to show that the hippocampus is highly involved in representing other conspecific, both in space and time, as was expected. And my lab is currently trying to take this to another different level. And the most immediate idea that comes to mind is whether the hippocampus is a general machine to represent abstract and physical spaces, right? So physical space is only one particular example of space to be mapped, but we are all social animals. And obviously, for all of us, it's very important to be able to map the abstract space of our social connection with others, as in these examples you can see from the Harry Potter books. This was basically the motivation behind this discovery. And if you think about it a little deeper, if you have such a representing of abstract social space, and it's composed obviously of different nodes, so each node would be probably representation of a particular concept of a different individual, right? So this representation should be involved in a individual, discrete representation of different individuals. So in trying to look for this representation in the hippocampus, we started to think what would be the behavior which will show us that such representation exists. And turn out that this behavior is exactly this. This behavior is called vocal labeling. The simple definition of vocal labeling is our ability to assign unique vocalization to either objects or conspecifics, right? So conspecifics are also kind of a physical object in the physical world. So vocal labeling is the ability to assign vocalization to different conspecifics. And naming, in the sense that we human use, is basically a sub-phenomena of this vocal labeling. We use particular unique vocalization to address different individuals. And the idea is that if we can show that such behavior exists in marmoset monkeys, I'm going to show in a second, this would be a very strong evidence that somewhere in the brain there must be a representation of this abstract social space. So this was the motivation behind the things. And so it turned out that besides human, as was mentioned in the introduction, besides us human being able to use naming to address different individuals, only 2 other species were recorded until today to be able to vocally label other conspecific. The most famous example is, of course, dolphins, which used unique singular vocal signatures to address different individuals. Uh, uh, so what's happening in dolphins, they actually get sort of tagged by their parents for a particular vocal signature, and they respond to this particular signature, and they are able to use other dolphin signature to address other dolphins, which seems to fit exactly this vocal labeling of other conspecific. And a bit of surprisingly, very recently, people have showed in different studies that even African elephants are capable of vocally labeling their conspecifics. So this is what we know, or was known until very recently. And in the context of human language, of course, the most the immediate questions that comes to mind is what's happening with non-human primates, right? If we human have this complex ability to vocally label others, to use naming, how come we don't see this in other non-human primates, right? So this is exactly the questions that we try to address. And we did this in marmoset monkeys. So for those of you who are not familiar with marmoset, it's a new animal model in neuroscience. If you look at the evolutionary tree, marmoset are sort of the lowest, closest non-human primates ancestor to humans. As you can see in this example, the size of a typical marmoset is about the size of a big rat. Another very important typical feature of marmoset is that the fact that they live in very structured family groups, which, by the way, are very similar to the human families. In each family group, there's always one alpha male and one alpha female, monogamous for life. and the rest are their offsprings. So in that sense, which seems to be a sort of a consequence similarity to human social structure, is probably very important in terms of evolution, because they probably had to deal with similar problems in order to survive. But maybe the most important feature or aspect of Marmoset in the context of the study I'm going to show today is the fact that they have a very complex vocal communication system. What you see here are typical example of different vocalization, stereotypical vocalization. You can see that each of them have a unique label that we human labeled. You can see here calls which are called phee, twitter, trill, and so on and so forth. The thing is that all marmoset use those different stereotypical calls in different combination, which seems to be some sort of a complex communication system which we know very little about. But today I'm going to focus only a particular call, which is called phee-call, which you can see here. You can see that compared to other stereotypical call, it seems like a very dull type of a call. This is another spectrogram showing a typical phee-call. On the x-axis you can see time, on the y-axis you can see the frequency, and the color code is power, of course, and you can see that it seems like to be a very dull, monotonously increasing vocalization, which drops down at the end. Doesn't seem to be very sophisticated, and this is how it sounds. Hope you can hear this. So it's a very high pitch vocalization. Actually, it's extremely loud. It's about 90 decibels from distance of 10 centimeter distance. So this small non-human primate, when he meets this call, when you are very close to it, it's a very painful experience. But what you should know about phee-calls is not only their dull vocal signatures, is the fact that phee-calls are actually a part of a very unique behavior. And this is probably the main story behind them. This is a typical example of a phee-call turn-taking conversation between marmoset monkeys. On the top graph, you can see the time representation of these calls. So the y-axis this time is amplitude, and the color code represent different calls from each one of the monkeys in the pair. And you can see that they exchange in a turn-taking manner the calls. Below, you can see the power spectrum representation. And the thing is that, so again, phee-call seems to be part of a very unique behavior. It's not only which probably tells the whole story behind them. Until recently, people were convinced that phee-call has something to do with localization, some sort of a localization call. So marmoset monkey live in the rainforest of South America, and whenever they lose eyesight to other members of the group, they immediately start to exchange those phee-call and turn-taking manner, which seems to fit very nicely the idea that those are actually a localization call. So I'm telling you, I'm here, and the other conspecific transmit its location in space to you. The fact that they live in this foliated rainforest jungle, those calls seems to be ideally suited for this particular task because it's a high pitch, high frequency call. So it's perfect for a relatively short range call distance. So what we did is actually, we didn't challenge this idea that phee-calls are a localization call, but we challenged the idea that maybe there's additional information hiding in those or encoded in those calls. And obviously, in order to test whether phee-calls contain additional information, we had to replicate this stereotypical behavior in lung condition. So this turned out to be a very simple task. All you need to do is to take two monkeys, place them in the same room, lower a visual barrier between them, leave the room, and they immediately start to exchange those fecal conversation. What's interesting is that the fact that in the colonies they use many types of calls, probably dependent on the social context, but in this particular social context, they emit 99.9% of the calls only phee-calls. And you can see here an example of a recording taken during one of the experiments. So we have two microphones. So each microphone is situated in front of one of the monkeys. And you can see that both microphones pick up the same calls, but you can see that we can easily tell which monkey was calling by the amplitude of the call. So the first call over here was emitted by the lower the monkey close to the lower microphone, and the respond was probably the other monkey, and this can be easily deduced by the amplitude. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because not only that we were able to easily replicate this behavior in lab condition, also by the way that we did the experiment, we could construct a fully labeled data set of many fecal conversation between many monkeys. So for each call, we knew exactly who was the caller and who was the receiver. And this is the key feature in this data set that allowed us to reveal the result I'm going to describe in a few moments. So in our experiment, we had 10 monkeys coming from 3 different family groups, which is also an important piece of information, which I'm going to explain and use in a few moments from now. And in total, we had about 54,000 calls for many combination of those 10 monkeys in different recordings. So now we were able to replicate the behavior in lab condition. We can record them. The next thing to do is, of course, to quantify the calls. There are many ways to do this. I'm not going to go deeply into this whole subject of how to quantify different vocalization. We decided on purpose to do something relatively simple and straightforward. So I'll briefly walk you through what we did. We represented each call in the time frequency domain, as you can see in this spectrogram. So again, x-axis is time, y-axis is frequency, and the color code is the amplitude. And from this representation, we extracted 2 vectors. The first vector describes the frequency modulation over time, as you can see here in blue. And the second vector here in red is the amplitude modulation over time. So we had 2 vectors. We normalized them for the amplitude. So we assumed that there is no information encoded in the amplitude of those calls. And we also made an additional assumption that the information, if it exists in those calls about the identity of the caller, doesn't change if you squeeze the call in time or expand it, which naively makes sense. If I say David in a normal speed, or I increase the speed, you will still be able to decode the information from the call. So we assumed this would be the case with phee-calls. We didn't know if that would be the case, of course, and it turned out that we were lucky. So just to summarize this, what we actually had at the end for each call is a set of 2 vectors, each one of them size 40. We concatenate those 2 vectors together, and now we represent each call and embed it in an 80-dimensional space. So now once we finish this, we are ready to start and analyze the data. And in order to test whether the calls contain any information about the identity of the caller, we used what we call random forest classifiers. So random forest classifiers is a type of classifier coming from the machine learning field. What's special about random forest classifier is the fact that they can classify or cluster together different representation, even though those representations are not linearly separable. So just to briefly explain this concept, what you see here on the left is a nice example of linearly separable 2 clusters. You can easily divide space by a straight line and classify those 2 clusters differently. This is what's happened usually when the underlying driving representation is linear, and vocalization are not linear, unfortunately. So what we actually have in reality is something which is depicted in B. So in this cartoon, you can see 2 different clusters, which are basically can be separated, but not by a simple linear hyperplane. And this is exactly what random forest classifiers do best. They're capable of forming this sort of so the best way for me to explain this, if you're familiar with the child game Minecraft, if you're familiar, there are sort of different agents in the game are composed from a structure which is like a connected boxes together. And this is exactly what random forest is doing, is building this convoluted separation between different classes by forming them from many boxes in high dimensional space. So random forest classifiers is our tool, and now we can take this classifier and train it on a subset of the data. Remember, I told you that we know exactly for each call what is the label of the caller and who is the receiver. And so we can train the classifier on a subset of the data and test it if it can decode the identity of the receiver. And this is exactly what we did here. So this is actually the result. I'm going to walk you through this example. What you see here is something called confusion matrix. On the x-axis are the true label of the calls. On the y-axis are the predicted receiver labels by the classifiers. If the classifier will be 100% correct, if you can detect in each time for each call what was the identity of the receiver, you would expect to see an accuracy of 100%, which would be on the diagonal, right? So on diagonal, there's a complete match between the true receiver label and the predicted receiver label. If the classifier would be 100% correct, you expect to see 100% on the diagonal. You don't see 100% accuracy on the diagonal, but you see extremely high numbers, right? So this tells you that in most of the cases, the classifiers, when we gave them calls which he never saw before, and asked them, tell us who is the receiver, he was correct. If this didn't convince you, maybe this would. What you see here is basically a similar representation to what I just showed you on the confusion matrix. So in color, you can see the distributions of the accuracies. So what I didn't mention before is the fact that in order to get a reliable, robust result from the classifiers, we actually used 100 classifiers. We repeated the process of classifying the identity of the receiver 100 times. We constructed 100 different models of classifiers and test each one of them independently. And what you see here is the distribution of the accuracies of all of those classifiers. So in color code, you can see the distribution of the classifier, true classifiers. In gray below, you can see the distribution of the accuracies of the same models, but when we fed them data after we shuffled the label of the caller, of the receiver. So we mixed the labels, and you can see that the accuracy level drops considerably actually to chance level. So in this case, the chance level is 25% because we have 4 different conspecific receivers for this particular color. And you can see that the shuffle distribution drops down to chance level. And it also shows you that the real accuracy is way above chance level. And if this didn't convince you yet, what you see here below are examples coming from different clusters. So these are real calls, but from each cluster, we took the most typical call for that cluster. So all of these calls are calls made by a monkey Adonis. By the way, I forgot to mention that what we see here is a model trained on calls from a single monkey. This monkey was Adonis. And what we see here below are a typical example from different clusters from calls of Adonis when he was calling either Ceto, Dia, Dionysus, or Ella. And already by eye, you can see that the calls are very different. So it seems like the monkey is using different calls when he is addressing different receivers. So this is one example of one monkey. This is another example from a different monkey. The accuracies on the diagonal are a bit different. In this case, a bit lower. But if you look on the comparison to the shuffle distribution, they're still highly significant. So also in this case, the classifier were able, in most of the cases, to decode the identity of the receiver monkey from the data. In fact, in all of our monkeys that we tested, so we used 10 monkeys. One monkey was removed from the data set because he hardly communicated. So for all of our 9 monkeys, the accuracy of the classifier to correctly identify the identity of the receiver was way above chance level. In all of our monkeys, as you can see in this distribution example, a few words about controls. So the first thing that comes to mind, I showed you that we represent each call by 2 different vectors, either the amplitude modulation vector or the frequency modulation vector. So one can easily think of an example that different amplitudes are used to label different individuals. It doesn't seem to be the case. What you see here for each monkey is the contribution of each of those vectors, frequency modulation or amplitude modulation, and you can see that for all of the monkeys, the contribution for the information that the classifier used to decode the identity of the receiver came in a similar proportion, both for the amplitude modulation but also from the frequency modulation. So both of them contributed in terms of information about the identity of the receiver. But the most important thing, which I have to point your attention to, which some of the people usually find it problematic, is the fact that the accuracies of the models were not 100% correct, right? So if you used to human naming, you expect the monkeys to be 100% correct, or at least close to it, and this is not exactly what we see here. And the reason for that is very simple. There's one hidden assumption about the construction in this experiment or the use of the random forest classifier, and this assumption is the assumption that the monkeys in the experiment always called the monkey on the other side, right? We labeled the calls based on this. But if you look closely, in this example, these are all calls made by monkey Adonis, dimensionally reduced to 2 dimensions using Tisney. It's not really important, and color code by the identity of the class that the classifier classified. You can see very nicely 4 different clusters with nice differentiation between the colors. But if you look closely, you can see that they're also mismatched, right? There are also cases, strange cases, when the classifier completely failed, right? So the most probable explanation for this is the fact that maybe the monkeys were not calling all of the time to the monkey on the other side. On average, I showed you, because the classifier were able to decode the identity of the receiver in most of the time, I can tell you clearly that on average, the monkey were calling the monkey on the other side, but probably not during all of the cases. In fact, if we look at the accuracy of the classifiers as a function of the call index during the experiment, so you have the first call, the second call, and so on and so forth. If the classifier would completely, if the call were always addressing the same monkey, you expect to see the classification accuracy stable, right, along the experiment. And this is not what we see, right? What we actually see is what you see in this graph. We can see a drop in the accuracy at the beginning, and then a gradual increase in the accuracy as the experiment proceeds, which suggests that monkey probably, so there are 2 ways to explain this. The first way is that the monkey sometimes call other monkeys. Another explanation is they have a very stereotypical strategy, right? So they start by calling other monkeys, and gradually they understand that the only partner for communication is the guy on the other side, and they resolve to those calls, as you can see in this graph. But the main point you need to take from this result is the fact that the real accuracies, right, are much higher in reality than the one we were able to pick up with these models. So the models are not perfect, okay? And I showed you why the models are not perfect, and the accuracy, the real accuracy, are probably much higher. Okay, another important finding or feature of those calls is the fact that what we show here is that the monkey calls are not simple imitation of the other monkey on the other side. One can easily think of a very simple strategy which will resolve in something similar to naming. If I would imitate the calls of different monkeys on the other side, I will get a very similar result, and it might look like a naming, but the thing is that I will not be able to say whether the naming actually represent the concept of the other conspecific on the other side, or maybe it's a simple technical imitation of the other guy on the other side. So there's a very simple way to prove that this is not the case. We had models, right, trained on each monkey. Now we can take all the calls from another monkey, but this time when the other monkey was calling the monkey that the model was trained of, right? If those calls were simple imitation, you expect those calls, either the monkey, the caller monkey of the model was calling monkey A, or monkey A was calling the monkey that the model was trained on a different experiment, right? If this would be simple imitation, you expect the model to detect them equally, right? It should be similar. If it's imitation, it's the same call. What you see from this graph is the fact that the accuracy when we're using the caller calls is obviously high, as I showed you. But when we use the same model, but this time on calls addressing the monkeys that we trained on from different monkeys, you can see that it significantly drops way almost down to zero, which simply proves that those calls are not simple imitation of the monkey on the other side. And this rules out a very known phenomena, which is called vocal accommodation. Vocal accommodation is a phenomena which was also described in humans. It's our tendency, our technical, non-controlled tendency to try and imitate our partner in conversation. It happens in human, it happens in other animals, and it seems to be something which is probably not controlled by a high cognitive circuit in the brain. And what this result shows you that this is not the case. In fact, it shows you that the vocalization that monkey pick up to use as a label for another monkey has nothing to do with the other monkey's calls. So it's not a simple imitation. Okay, so I showed you up till now basically that those calls contain information about the identity of the receiver. But this says nothing about the fact or whether monkeys are actually aware and use this information, right? The fact that the information is there doesn't say that the monkeys are using it. So in order to test this, we used a very similar experiment. We placed one monkey on one side of the visual barrier, but instead of putting another monkey on the other side, we placed a computer system which was tapped to the database that we recorded. And we used a very simple heuristic for the computer system to engage in a fecal conversation with the monkey on the other side based on simple heuristics that we extracted from real conversation between two monkeys. And lo and behold, we were able to sort of fool the monkey. I'm sure we didn't fool the monkey, but we were able to lure the monkey to engage in sort of a free conversation with a computer system, right? So now we have a handle on the conversation, and now because we have a handle, we can decide now which calls to use in the conversation, right? We can play with the identity of either the caller or the receiver. And when we do this, we found out and as you can see in this example, that the probability for a real monkey to respond in a fecal conversation to a call which was addressed to him is extremely and significantly higher when we use a call which was addressing a different monkey. Right? This is another way to look at it. This time you have on the x-axis you have time from the call onset, and you can see that when the call is directed to that particular monkey, by directed I mean that the call we know that the call was recorded when another monkey was calling the real monkey in this particular example. You can see that the directed call and non-directed call diverge very quickly over time, but this is a very strong evidence proving that the monkey are aware of the identity being called to them, and they actually use it in their behavior. They respond in a different way, whether it's a directed or non-directed call. The next question that we wanted to tackle was obviously, do different monkeys use similar calls or different labels to address the same receiver? Like us humans, we use a unique label for each individuals, and different members of our group use the same label to address the same individual. So the most naive thing to do, instead of constructing a model which was trained on a particular single monkey, now we can take all the calls from all of the monkey and train a model to see if we can detect the identity of the receiver. Right? This is a way to see whether different monkeys use similar labels to call other monkeys. This is the confusion matrix as I showed you before. X-axis is true receiver label. Y-axis is the predicted label. On the diagonal, you can see already by the color code that it's higher than chance level, as you can see on the right. Again, in gray, you can see the shuffle distributions. In color code, you can see the distribution of the accuracies from the real data, and you can see that the accuracies are above chance level. But the first thing that you see when you look at this on these accuracies, you can see that it's significantly dropped, right? So something happened here. We sort of lose information. So it turned out that there are two explanations for this result. So the first explanation is the explanation that we wanted to reach or wanted to prove, is that each monkey is using, so all monkeys use similar code to address the same receiver. So like us human, different monkeys use the same name to address the particular individual, but there's another potential explanation, and this is that each monkey uses a completely unique set of calls, but different, to address the same group of monkeys, which basically means that each monkey in our database have 9 different names coming from 9 different monkeys, right? So it seems like the result that I showed you, we would reach the same result in either scenario. So actually there's a third scenario. And the third scenario is sort of a mix between those two. And I'm going to show you that this is actually what's happening in reality. And this third scenario is a scenario that different groups of monkeys use similar name to address the same monkeys. So let me show you if this is the case. So the first thing that I have to show you is the sort of the mechanism that we use to detect whether different monkeys use similar names, and we resorted to a different strategy. Instead of using the models themselves, we decided to use a simple similarity measure, right? So you can take 2 calls from 2 different monkeys when they were addressing the same monkey and ask how similar those 2 calls are to each other, right? But in order to do this, there's a problem you have to overcome. I told you before that the calls are non-linear separable, so you cannot use linear measures like correlation. So it turned out that random forest classifiers have an inherent mechanism to measure similarity. And this mechanism is called proximity. It sounds complicated, but I hope I'll be able to explain in very simple words, because it's quite simple. So if you look under the hood, each random forest classifier is composed from a set of decision trees. It's a type of machine learning classifiers, and it's composed of many decision trees. Again, without going into the details, in each model we had 150 trees. If the 2 calls are similar, they would end up in each of the decision tree in the same decision node. This is how those trees work. They use decision trees, and if if the calls are similar, they are supposed to end up on the same decision leaf. So the measure of similarity is simply counting the proportion of trees that two calls ended up on the same decision node, right? So if the calls are very similar, we expect to see a very high proportion. If they are completely non-similar, the proportion should drop considerably. So now when we have this similarity measure, we can use this for the data. We can take calls from two different monkeys, all the calls that two different monkeys made for the same receiver, right? So we have many pairs of calls from a single pair going to different colors, and in each of those pairs we can calculate the similarity between those calls, right? If two different monkeys use the same label, we expect to get high proximity values for those two different monkeys when they are calling different monkeys. And this is exactly what we did here. What you see here is the average similarity matrix. It looks complicated. I'll explain this. So the x-axis and the y-axis are different monkeys, right? So if we take, for example, Ella, right? We take all the calls from Ella and Adonis. Can you see my cursor, by the way? Okay, so I'll do it without the cursor. So we take all the calls from Adonis on the y-axis and Ella on the x-axis, and we calculate the proximity for each pair of calls when Adonis and Ella were calling the same monkey, and we average the similarity between all those calls. And this average similarity is color-coded in this matrix. So pairs of monkey with similar calls to other monkeys would show relatively light colors, and non-similar would show dark colors. And this is exactly what you see here. So the first impression when looking at this matrix, you can see that some sort of structure in the matrix. And surprisingly, this matrix can be explained by a very simple fact that I didn't share with you yet. And this fact is the fact that I ordered the monkeys based on their family structure. And I also used these color lines to separate the different families. So Adonis, Seto, and Ella is one family. Bumi, Brahma, Balu, etc., till Bolt is a second family, and Dia and Dionysus are the third family. And you can see by eye, if you squint, you can see that the monkeys from the same family tend to have lighter colors, right? Another way to look at it is to take the same data, the average similarity measurement for each pair of monkey, the same data you see in this matrix, and present it in a different way. Instead of putting a color code, I can use them as a vector and project them down to two-dimensional space. And what you immediately see is that the similarity is clustered into the family groups, which again shows you very nicely and very clearly that monkey from the same group tend to use similar calls when addressing the same monkey, right? So this is one evidence suggesting the different monkey groups use similar names to address different monkeys. Another way to look at it is compare the average similarity between monkey from the same group, as you can see here in purple, for the different family groups. We have three different families on the x-axis. We have a distribution of similarities when I'm using the similarities within the family or between members of the family and other members of the family. And I'm doing this for each of the three groups. And you can easily see that the similarity between members of the same groups is consistently higher and significant than with members from other groups, right? So it seems like we have an answer, right? It seems like members from the same group use similar codes to address other monkeys, but we're not quite there yet. And I'll maybe some of you felt it or understood this. So there could be another explanation, right? So different monkeys from the same group tend to use similar, I don't know, dialect or something, but it doesn't say that the names are the same or the labels. So I should use the term labels, not names. It's not a proof that labels from the monkeys from the same groups, right? Similar labels for a particular monkey, right? There could be a general component of similarity between clumps of monkey from the same group. So in order to nail this down, we did the following things. We calculated the distribution or the average similarity between calls between pairs of monkey from the same group when they were calling the same monkey, shown here in sort of pinkish color, and compare this to the similarity or the distribution of similarity when they were calling a different monkey. So in this case, monkeys were always from the same group, either calling the same monkey, right, or calling a different monkey. So if monkeys are using similar labels to call a particular individual, you expect that the similarity when they are calling the same individual will be higher than the similarity when they are calling a different individual. And this is exactly what you see here. So this is a very strong evidence that monkeys from the same family group use similar labels to address different monkeys. Okay, so there's another hidden result in this set of data, which is very interesting. So going back to the sample presentation I just showed you a slide ago, this is a dimensionality reduction of the average similarity in the similarity space. And you can see the family clustered together. Another important piece of information I didn't share with you so far is the fact that two of the families in this experiment were artificially paired. Or in other words, in two of the families, the individuals are not genetically related and are completely adults. And still, I showed you that for all of the families, monkeys tend to use similar labels to the same monkeys, which the only way to explain this, right, is the fact that they learn to label different conspecifics from their group members, which is there's a very simple term for this phenomenon or behavior, which is called vocal learning. So this is a very strong evidence for a non-human primate, which vocally learned from his conspecific while he is a complete adult and has nothing to do with genetics. So the information cannot be transferred genetically, they have to learn it. So this is another piece of result I wanted to share with you. And before I continue, let me go back. So at this point, I'd like to mention or emphasize something very important. So I'll go back to this slide. So up to now, I showed you two types of models. One type of models were trained on calls from single monkey, and another type of a model, which I call the general model, was trained on all calls from all monkeys. And just to phrase what I showed you until now, I showed you one very successful type of model. So the models we were trained on single monkeys were very successful in identifying the identity of the receiver monkey. But I also showed you a very bad model, and this is this model. In this model, the accuracy are significant, but very low. But the reason that the accuracies in the general model are very low, as I just showed you in this result, is the fact that each monkey in our experiment had 3 different names coming from 3 different families. And this is why this model is so bad, right? But still, it was good enough to contain the information, right, that different family members, different groups use different models, and to show us that monkeys vocally learn from the other group members. So this is a very important point, right? So usually people see this model and are sort of discouraged by seeing those low accuracies, and they are correct. This is a bad model, but still we can extract a lot of information from this. Okay, this is the point I wanted to stress at this part, and I want to move to the last question. So we during the study, when we presented these results to many other scientists and people, they were always very interested in which acoustic features are being used by this monkey to encode the receiver identity information, which in a way sounds very natural, or I would say even naive question. What if there is sort of a general mechanism or rules to code different individuals? Would be very interesting. If you use a particular set of features to encode the native receiver, that would be a highly interesting phenomena. But there's a problem with these questions. And this problem is the fact that usually what people, to be able to do this, right, you have to decide in advance by which feature you use to represent the different calls, right? So there's a sort of a circular thing here. If I decide what are the features, right, how can I tell what are the features which the monkeys are using? I'm using, when I decide what are the features, I decide on an arbitrary set of features. I have no way in advance to know which are the important features. So there's a circular problem with this, but nevertheless, because people were so many obsessed with these questions, we did the following things. We decided artificially on a set of vocal features. As you can see in this example, these are the features that we chose. We chose 8 features from the FM part of the representation and another 8 from the AM modulation. And now, instead of having a vector in 80-dimensional, embedded in 80-dimensional space for each call, we have a vector size 16, right? Each dimension is this feature, which represent different calls. And now we can test, right? What's the explained variance by each of the features that we artificially chose. And this is exactly what you see here. Each bar plot represent here a vector of explained variance. How much of the variance of each feature explain the ability of the model to distinguish between two different individuals. And when you look at it at first sight, all of the monkeys, you can see it seems like a mess, right? Doesn't seem to be structured. It seems like the different monkey use different features, but if you order them by the family membership, as we see here, so each column is a different family, you can see by eye that there is a very strong similarity between the explained variance feature vectors for each family, right? Which basically says that each family seems to use a different set of features to encode information about the identity of the other receiver. Another way to describe this result in a more palatable way is to say that each family group seems to use sort of a different dialect, right? In analogy to humans, so each family has a different dialect, and it uses this unique dialect of her to decode and encode information about the identity of the receiver. Another way to show this graphically, as in a similar trick I showed you before, is to project those vectors. So each explained variance is basically a vector. You can project it to 18-dimensional space and do dimensionality reduction. This is exactly what you see here, projected to 2 dimension. You can see that the families cluster together. There seems to be an overlap between the green family and the blue family, but this is only because I'm showing you only 2 dimensions. Okay, so it's very clear that each family seems to use a different dialect. So to sum up, what I've showed you today is actually the first discovery of vocal labeling of others in non-human primate, which was not known before. As I told you at the beginning, besides human, until now, only dolphins and elephant were shown to be able to vocally label as other conspecifics. I would even go further, and I would say that what we show here has nothing to do with imitation, has nothing to do with vocal accommodation, and it seems to be that somewhere in the brain, the monkeys simply hold a mapping between a vocalization and a representation of a particular identity of a receiver. I also showed you that monkey is not only, so the information is not only encoded in the codes, the monkey actually use it and aware of this information, right? So they deliberately do this and use it for their behavior. They respond more when they are called to calls which are they are labeled by. I also showed you that the monkey members learn those labels from other monkey members of the family, which is a vocal learning. And I also showed you that family members use, or different families use similar dialect to encode this information. Now, I'd like to, before I stop, I'd like to put everything in the general context. And in my view, I think this results actually touching to one of the unsolved mysteries, I think, in science in general. And it can be phrased very simply by saying, is human language an evolutionary a singular phenomena, like a Big Bang phenomena, right? It sounds a catchy title, but if you think about it even deeper, the Chomskyan idea is that human developed language sort of out of nothing. Something happens that we humans have a unique neural circuit which enabled us to develop this marvelous thing which is called language. I didn't show you language in monkeys, but what I did show you, right, is something which is contrary to what people or Chomsky people think about non-human primate vocal communication. And this is the fact it was considered until very recently an innate phenomena, genetically encoded and inflexible. What I showed you today is a very flexible usage of vocalization in the context of vocal labeling. So it's completely contrary to what we thought until today about non-human primate vocal communication. And another way to look at it, this idea of this ability of flexible usage of vocalization in humans all of a sudden appear human is basically a complete contradiction to one of the most successful theory in science in general, the evolutionary theory. And what I've showed you today is an example of probably a convergent evolution of flexible usage of language in non-human primates. I don't think that vocal labeling in primates is the precursor for human language in general, but I do think that Marmoset seems to handle or seem to had to cope with similar problems that humans because of the similar social structure, which forced them to find similar solution. And this vocal labeling is a similar solution to probably to the first hominoids who were developing their communication. And I also showed you a cut at the beginning, so I'd like to have a nice closure. The title of the talk is The Naming of Non-Human Primates, and it comes, it's a paraphrase of a very famous song by T.S. Eliot, so you're probably familiar even more than you are probably aware, The Naming of Cats, which the Cats musical is based on. And it's a lovely song. It's written here. I'm not going to read the whole poem for you, but the main gist or the connection to what I showed you today is the fact that T.S. Eliot suggests that each cat has at least 3 different names, like us, our monkeys. The first name is the name that his family gives him, right? The second name is probably the name that he'd received from his, it's like the genius, the thief, the cruel, something which he gets from society. We don't know which names that we discovered, right? Whether it's something given to him by his family or it's a role name. We cannot tell from what I showed today, but nevertheless, those 2 different options are extremely interesting. And as a neuroscientist, maybe the final type of a name that each cat had is the names that only he knows himself. And this is probably related to consciousness and more complicated thing that I can talk about here in general. But it's a nice, I think it catches the essence of the study. And before I stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions, these are the members of my lab. In particular, I would like to mention Guy Owen and Anna Shapira, who participate in this particular project, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, David, so much for that very data-rich talk. I'm sure the audience is curious about unpacking some of the details. So yeah, we're gonna open the floor for questions now. And just a reminder to you can either post your questions into the chat log where I can read them out loud, or select the raise hand function, and then I can call upon speakers in order. And if you're comfortable doing so, feel free to introduce yourself and say something about your background before speaking as well. Yeah, Carrie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks. I mean, nobody else seemed to raise their hand, so might as well. So I'm Carrie Food. I'm working actually with two other people who are here, Diana Reese and Fran Dolans, on a dolphin study on labeling. And I guess my question, I'll be very simple about it. So I'm trying to understand how you, as a researcher, might distinguish the labeling from naming. So as far as I understood the results at the end with the families, um, so I sort of interpret as saying, okay, let's say you have one family, the Smiths, another the Joneses, and another the O'Haras. And let's say there's one other marmoset that they are labeling, and they recognize them by various features. And it could be that the one that they're labeling is big and he's, fat and he's hairy or something. Take any features, some sort of relational feature or whatever. So you could say that, okay, the Smiths call him the big one or the biggest one, and the Joneses call him the fat one or the fattest one. And the O'Haras call him the hairy one or the hairiest one. And I noticed that when you were talking, you said, well, I shouldn't say naming, I should say labeling. And I thought that was correct and also interesting. So it's just my question is, what do you what else do you think might be needed experimentally to show that these are names rather than just individual labels that are not names?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think your question actually boils down. I have a hammer and everything looks like a nail for me. I'm a neuroscientist, and for me it boils down to whether there's a discrete representation of an individual, right? It's another way to phrase your question if I understand your question correct, right? I know that I get this question quite a lot and, from the dolphin community, and usually people mention this cross-modality representation of others in dolphins as evidence that this is actually so the whistle calls are tied to a discrete representation of that particular dolphin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that one way to do is to use cross-model testing in behavior. I think the most or the more robust way to do this is to show cross-modal neural representations, which is tied to this vocalization, meaning the same set of neurons are activated, right? When, let's say, I hear a monkey, particular monkey, and when I see his picture, right? And the interesting thing about this is that even before we published our study, there was a very nice published other paper published in Science showing that there's a cross-modal neural representation, right, invariant representation in the marmoset hippocampus, which is tied to phee-calls, either to phee-calls or to picture of particular monkeys, which I think is a very strong evidence to suggest that this is what we see here.
Okay. Could you maybe put that paper in the chat?
Yes, sure. I'll do it later. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.
Actually, yes.
Oh yeah, Diana, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, David, for a beautiful talk and such a detailed talk. And it just raised so many interesting questions for me. One of the things I found striking is that it reminds me a lot actually, of some of the elephant reports, the two studies that were done on elephants where they had two different individuals using two different calls for this towards the same individual and getting a response. So there seems to be something similar. And, we're all trying to understand the nature of these calls and what these others are using that may not be the same kinds of referentiality that we use as humans. And I just thought it just brought up so many interesting questions for me. I just wanted to clarify something quite simple. When you were describing the experimental setup where you had the pairs of monkeys and you were recording from both of those, and then you showed the turn-taking behavior, were the animals emitting their own call or the call of their partner? Could you just explain that a little bit more? Because I know they were making the calls of the others, but in the first experiment, were you saying when they were emitting a call, was it the call of their partner or their own call, or what you think is their own call?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but in general, I think it's probably had to do with the. Okay, I'll explain the exact experiment. What we did, we just took pairs of monkeys, introduced them into the room, right? They knew who is on the other side. They saw him, and then we lowered a visual barrier and left the room. And what spontaneously happens is that they immediately start to exchange those phee-call turn-taking. So those different bouts of conversations, when they exchange phee-call, one is calling, the other one is answering, one is calling, the other one answering. Then there's a silence for a few moments, and then they start over. And there are different lengths for those different dialogues, short dialogues. So in each experiment, both of the monkey were emitting phee-calls.
Right, but I guess it's the calling and answering that the words you're using, calling and answering. Maybe I haven't had enough coffee yet this morning, so pardon me. So David, if you and I are talking right now, and we were doing what they were doing, would I be first in the first exchange? Am I emitting my name, or am I using or my phee-call, or am I doing your phee-call the very first time?
Okay, so I think what's confusing me is that you use the terms my phee-calls or your phee-calls for a particular monkey. So what the monkeys are actually doing is that they are calling the other monkey. So when I'm using a phee-call, the phee-call people have shown before that phee-calls, of course, contain information about the caller identity, right? This is not surprising, right? Because each one has a different physical structure, so information is physically there anyway. But each call is unique to that particular receiver, so it's labeled to the monkey on the other side. There's no, it's not like dolphin that they have those whistles which are associated with themselves.
That's what I was, yeah,
No.
thank you, David. That's what I was trying to clarify. And that's one of the discussions we've had with the elephants, because of the animals that we see use these. We have dolphins and elephants so far. And so if you and I were doing it, I wouldn't be emitting Diana. I would be saying David, and you would be saying something more like Diana. That's what that is. I just wanted to clarify that. It wasn't absolutely clear to me in that. So that it's just because we also know, just to clarify, that we and others, many others before we ever saw it, were able to see that dolphins will emit calls of others as well. That's been well documented now. But you're showing this. Okay, thank you. I just wanted that to clarify that. Thank you so much.
Joanne, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was really rich, and I also have a lot of questions, but I wanted to ask a couple of things. The first one is in your accuracy models. When these are done with natural human conversations, are humans 100% accurate when they're naming each other? Like, I just think about when we use different tones to like give different meanings, like with your example of David, like David, you know, like just wondering that. And then my second question is more on like the interspecies like context, right? I'm assuming these marmosets are captive, right? So they are engaging with humans quite often. So I wonder if you found in your like vast data set, if they have phee-calls for humans, if are their caretakers, right? And I'm wondering as well, how do these marmosets respond to their human created labels, right? If they are engaging in some type of dialogue that you're able to identify in your recordings, and if your models are picking those up when you're having human marmoset interactions. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'll start with the first questions. So if I understood correctly, you asked whether if I apply the same models to humans, would I get 100% accuracy? So first of all, we never did this, but before going deeply into the details, I have to stress that naming in humans is a completely different phenomena that I'm showing here, right? It's a much more complicated phenomena. We use unique vocalization in a much more complex way when we label others. So the comparison is like you're taking orange and apples. That's one thing. In terms of the models, so first of all, if I use the same models, they would be training or picking up completely different, probably different set of features, right? Because it's a different phenomena. I would expect the accuracies to be very high simply because humans can follow instructions, right? I can tell a pair of humans to call only particular humans, so I would expect the accuracy to be very high. And this is something for us with monkeys, it's very hard, right? I showed you that monkeys are probably sort of in some of the cases tend to call also probably other monkeys. So this is for the first question. I hope I answered clearly. Regarding the second question, whether Marmoset vocally labels humans, right? We haven't tested this. The thing is that, well, there are two obstacles to this, right? So in order to be able to train a model to distinguish between, to say this is a label of a particular object or monkey or human, you need enough repetition of that, right? So in our simple experiment with monkeys, the repetition, I mean, it's a natural behavior. We don't force anything, and we are luckily enough to have this behavior spontaneously emerging with high quantities and ends that we can use with our models. If I try to think about the way to do it, to force marmoset monkeys to label humans in a very robust, which would be very efficient for our models, this is a very complicated experiment. Or at least I don't have a good idea how to do this. But it's definitely an interesting direction. I mean, whether marmoset also vocally label other objects or humans, I mean, I'm not sure they do it.
Thank you for those questions, Joanne.
Jeff,
Take us.
thank you, David. I study wolf communication, and there's mainly wild ones, but there's some studies on frequency modulation and amplitude modulation indicating some sort of labeling going on between wolves and recognition of with howls. I was looking at your slide on each family uses a different dialect where you grouped the plots of the features and noticed that the last 3 features and the 7th to last and a few more all consistently explained variance across the family groups. Am I understanding that correctly on that slide? I didn't know which plot corresponded to which feature on your previous slide, but I just noticed that there was similarity across the family groups with certain features. Am I understanding that correctly?
You have another question, or should I answer this one?
Go ahead. No.
Okay. Okay, so regarding the features, so well, I agree with you that by eye it seems like there is something over there in terms of a particular feature comes up, but unfortunately they didn't fail. They failed to pass statistical tests. So I cannot say with statistical rigorous that a particular set of features are being used by all of the families to encode information. But you have to also remember that the problem is that I chose those features completely artificially. I mean, I know people in the community tend to use these arguments, but I found them a bit problematic, and this finding about dialect is the best I thought I can extract from this data. I mean, I think we cannot really, I mean, we can, I don't know, maybe we can target by chance a particular feature and discover something, but it doesn't say anything about the features that we missed. So I don't know how much you can say from this.
No, that's great. I agree with you. I just wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. Thank you.
Francis.
Thank
Hello.
you so much. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. That was so interesting. Thank you. I'm gonna out myself as very naive about this right now, but I'm interested in your modeling, and I'm wondering if that is kind of like standard procedure when you are studying animal vocalizations, particularly the model where you had the different shapes. I would just like love to know some more about how that works because I found myself a little bit lost during that part of the chat, and I was wondering if you have any like resources or anything you think I should look at in order to understand that better.
Okay, great. Yes. First of all, vocalization field is new for me. So if I think the fact that so what we did, I think it's not standard in the field of vocalization. What we basically did is we took very powerful tools for machine learning and applied them to this data. And this is something which I think people are starting to do in the field of vocalization, but I think it's only a start. I mean, it's a classical example. You take a very powerful tool from our field, apply them to a different field, and you start to see things you didn't see before. That's basically it. Random forest classifier are standard in the field of machine learning. In fact, they're considered to be nowadays, the field of machine learning, they're considered to be very non-fashionable, relatively old tools, but they are classic tools, and you can find out about them if you pick any standard machine learning textbook that you can, or take a course or something. This is in that field, it's pretty standard.
Thank you, David. And Francis, yeah, I think Mickey Pardo used as similar tools, I think, in his study, the random forest classifier.
Yes.
Diana, go. Yeah. You're still muted.
Sorry, I don't want to ask a second question if there are others who still have questions. Am I the next person? I'm only,
I
is
I
that?
think you're the next one, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a couple other things, David. Again, I found this talk really fascinating. I just wanted to get a little bit more information about the social contexts that the animals were in. So when these three different family groups, were they all also housed together at all? Were they heard each other using calls towards the same individuals? That's what one of the things I found really fascinating, that you got the different calls from that were, there was this convergence within family groups about the calls. I don't know if that's the right word, but they were using this. My understanding is the three different family groups were using a shared call for those individuals. Is that correct? And there were differences between the family groups, not within. Is that right?
No, what
Did
I
I get
showed
that
is
wrong?
that each family group is using a sort of a unique set of labels to address all the other monkeys. The thing
Right.
is, actually, it's a very perceptive question, because if what I showed you is correct, you wouldn't expect monkeys from one family to be able to call monkeys from different families, because in reality, in natural condition, in their habitat, they usually don't. I mean, marmoset are highly territorial, and they actually fight for their territory. It's very clear where there is their territories. And in our case, it's a very artificial social situation, because so each family share the same housing cage, but all of the cages are housed together in the same room. So all of them heard all of the other monkeys from the other families. So it's a very highly unnatural condition, and probably this is what allowed us to find this, right? So we sort of
Thank you for
make
clarifying.
from the limits. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes it even more interesting. That's what I was wondering
Yeah.
about. Yeah. Oh, wow. Thanks. Thank you for that. Okay, thanks.
We don't seem to have any other questions at the moment. Maybe before wrapping things, I mean, I was just curious if you know anything about sort of at what stage of development that marmosets develop this vocal labeling ability, and if there may be like other forms of vocal learning in infant marmosets that are similar to this. Maybe a relationship between vocal labeling and babbling, which I understand infant marmosets use as well.
Yeah, so first of all, we didn't do a developmental study, so we didn't test if they learn this from the parents and so on and so forth. People have shown in marmoset that the marmoset develop or learn to produce, let's say, phee-calls from their parents. They babble at the beginning, and slowly it evolves. All of our experiments were done on adult monkeys. In fact, one of the groups, I showed you if you remember, one of the group had 3 monkeys. So there were 3 monkeys, but actually separated by time. So it was a pair A, and then one of the female was exchanged for an additional period of time. What's interesting about this is the fact that the new introduced female learned, and of course this is only, I don't have enough repetition to say something about this, but so this is only observational, but this new introduced female learned to use similar labels that the male was using to other monkeys, right? So there's no development here, it's an adult monkey. So it seemed to be like a pure vocal learning. So the bottom line is we don't have any information about development and how how vocal labeling, ability to vocally label others, develop over the course of development. But we do have very strong evidence for classical vocal learning in adults.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Diana or Francine? Maybe, Francine.
Let Fran go first.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't
Thanks.
want to hug it.
Thank you for a really, really fascinating talk. This has been a topic that Diana, Carrie, and also Brenda, who's not here, Brenda McCowan, and I have been working on for about 3 or 4 years and thinking about in slightly different ways. Diana and Brenda are working on the dolphin side of our project, and I'm working with bonobos, so another primate species. And I'm really fascinated by your findings, especially I'll just put it in context that when we first put in the request for funding, we were told by our funders, the Templeton World Charity Foundation, by our program officer that this is not a thing, studying naming in animals is not a thing. And I was like, no, it is a thing. It hasn't been done before. And so it's really nice to see parallels of other people who are studying this in multiple different species. So my question is really about the ecology of marmosets in relation to the naming. And as you mentioned that marmosets, so I've worked tamarins in captivity and in the wild, and they have sort of similar profiles in terms of their ecology and social structures. And I'm just really interested, sorry, I have a cat, um, uh, interested in the idea that they're learning the names of other groups around them and identifying them, because even though they're very territorial, they also end up having to leave their natal groups and form pairs with somebody from other groups. So they have to know who's there, that there's a male or there's a female who's about the right age. And, that the idea of, do they end up learning the names? I mean, I'm sort of in my imagination projecting this, do they learn the name of, somebody who they like, is Gabriel's over in that other group. I think, he's really, got an attractive voice. I haven't seen him yet, but, he sounds good. And, and he sounds like he's about the right age or something, and, could you extend or could you speculate about how this naming might be foundational to holding up the social structure of not just groups, but of also populations? So that's sort of a big question. Thank you.
First of all, it's a fascinating direction and question. I'm not sure I'm the person who's able to give you a good answer. So first of all, I'm a neuroscientist, and I don't study marmoset in the wild. And my focus is sort of inward into the brain. Although I think behavior is you cannot study the brain without behavior. But personally, I never studied them in the wild. So I cannot give you a definite answer for this. But I can speculate based on the physical properties of phee-calls and the fact that marmoset are extremely territorial. So phee-calls are extremely high-pitched, which means that the energy drops very, very drastically as a function of distance. So I would assume that this type of communication is very effective in close range, right? A few meters. And marmoset, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the territories can be quite big in the wild. I know that there were a lot of studies about the size of territories, and by the way, and they have this group territorial behavior, and they fight over them. So I'm not sure technically how much they can gather information, vocal information, at least in terms of phee-calls, from other groups in the wild. But it's an extremely interesting question.
Thank you. Yeah, Diana, you want to hop on again?
You-
I think you're still muted.
Thought I just unmuted. Thank you. Just another quick question. This is something that you may have data on, and you didn't talk about it yet, but I remember many years ago, a long time ago, there was a study done with green monkeys, I think they were. I may have gotten the species wrong, and I cannot remember, unfortunately, who did the study, but they cross-fostered green monkeys where they had, let's say, for example, group A and group B, and they were looking at their isolation calls or their group. It may have been a long call or a contact call. I don't actually remember the specifics, but it was a shared call amongst the group. And they found that each group had a particular, I think they were like rising calls. And what they found, the result that was so interesting was when they cross-fostered the animals from group A, for example, their beginning frequency was, let's say, 4K, and the B group, their start or beginning frequency was 6K. And when they cross-fostered them, they converged. When they brought an animal from group B in to group A, cross-fostering it, it converged and matched the beginning frequency of that group. You may have data on that. I don't know if you looked at that within your family groups, if they're converging on the beginning frequency, and whether there's something in there about the calls that those family members are using within their own groups and what you may be getting in the calls they're using. I'm just throwing it out there because it seemed to me it might be very relevant. Brenda McGowan and I also showed this with dolphins many years ago, that when we did a principal components analysis on groups of dolphins, the social groups converged most on the beginning frequency. There seemed to be, that may be something important for group identity or something you may find. I just wanted to throw that out there. If you haven't looked at it, could be interesting. I don't really need an answer. I don't know if you saw it or not, but just wanted to share that with you.
Well, actually, I think if I understand correctly, the phenomenon to describe falls very nicely under the definition of vocal accommodation, right? And this is something which is at least it's considered to be a relatively low level mechanism, meaning that we converge even unconsciously. I mean, this is like even if I talk to a person as a human, I talk to a person, I tend to match his, I don't know, frequency range or even amplitude range. It's something intentional. First of all, I cannot give you an answer because I haven't tested it, but one of the main reasons for this is because we were very careful or worked very hard to prove or to come up with a convincing evidence that what we see here is not vocal accommodation. And I think we have a very solid set of evidence for this. So in a way, we sort of we try to get as far as possible from this phenomena. So I don't have any data on this.
Yeah, David, I don't mean that it's not vocal learning. I'm saying there may be multiple things happening. So for example, my last name is Reese. I have an identifier based on my family. So that may function as for group identity is more what I'm saying in terms of the beginning frequency. I agree with you. What you're showing something looks like vocal learning. Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Great. Francis.
Hi, again. I was wondering if you could make a little bit more explicit the connection between the hippocampus and the cells that you were talking about, the spatial cells, I think it was called. And the connection between that and the monkey's ability to like identify another specific being.
Yeah. Okay. So you mean the connection between what I've showed you and place cells?
Yeah, I was assuming that there would.
I got you. So the idea is that we hypothesize that the hippocampus is a general mechanism to map a space. It could be physical space. If it's physical space, so that would involve place, what people call place cells, and other types of cells, but they are all spatial representations, right? You form sort of a cognitive map of physical space. So following this line, if the hippocampus is a general mechanism to map space, or in other words, it's a general mechanism to build a model of the space, right? To enable you to survive. So if it's a physical space, you know everything, whereas everything you can use this to survive. It's also very important for you to map other type of abstract spaces, and a social space is a type of space. So the hypothesis is that the hippocampus is involved in forming a cognitive map of this abstract social space. And this social space is where I am compared to others in social dimensions of many features. So I don't know, who's the alpha male, who's the subordinate animal, etc. Who's my family, who is my mother, etc. And so this is the hypothesis, and and sort of this the fact that phee-calls have encode information about the receiver probably means that whenever the monkey is emitting a phee-calls with a particular identity, a set of neurons, part of this mapping, is being activated. That's the connection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks. This will be quick. I forgot to mention my education's in as a linguist of human languages. I'm not a biologist, but I think it was in 2024. I think it's still a preprint. I'm not sure, but Eden Blank and others, including Ev Fedorenko, published a paper on some unique neural paths to the hippocampus from the language system of humans. And I was wondering if, of course, they're using fMRI and a few other things to do that. But I was pretty intrigued by that article in terms of what human language is doing in recruiting the hippocampus for perhaps semantic relationships in space. Is there any data on that or any studies in non-human primates or anything else that are showing those pathways?
I think it's a very understudied direction. It's a new idea that I think the hippocampus is probably involved in some way in language processing in humans, right? So and the reason we got into this is because not accidentally, but turned out that vocal communication is sort of a handle to find neural representations of in this case social space. In terms of the literature, I'm not aware of any, but maybe I'm missing about animals studies on this. Well, animal studies are not about language, right, but about vocal communication, and I think you said correctly. I think the idea is that what's special about the mapping in the hippocampus. So a mapping in general is not a list of in this case, individuals, or in the physical space, a list of position in space. A mapping is a relational representation, meaning I need to know what's the relation between point A and point B in space. And the information is this relational information. And this is what we're trying to look for in the hippocampus. It's nice that we have a representation, discrete representation of individuals, but the relational information is the missing. It's the holy grail, the missing thing that we're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like Queen and King are related, Queen and Rock are not.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great. If you ever, see something in non-human literature on that, I'd love to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's about all the time that we're going to have today. So yeah, please join me in thanking Dr. Omer for this fascinating presentation and the exciting research coming out of your lab. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to learn more about David's work, please check out the Omer Lab website and follow him on social media. I shared some links in the chat where you can do that. And yeah, and thanks as always to the Interspecies Internet community for your continued engagement and your interest in our monthly lecture series. If you want to learn more about our organization or stay up to date with our event schedule, projects, and other activities, if you're interested in assisting our programming with donations or connecting with a community of researchers and enthusiasts, then please visit us online. You can follow our social media, visit our YouTube channel, join our Slack, or subscribe to our newsletter. Caro just posted all the links in the chat for you there. So please, yeah, check them out. On behalf of the Interspecies Internet, the trustees in our community, thank you again, Dr. Omer, for making the time to be with us and share your work. We hope to see everyone again next month for another event, and have a wonderful weekend.